Congressman McGovern, thank you so much for speaking with Voice of America.
Happy to be with you.
You were part of the congressional delegation led by Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi to Dharamsala, where you met with the Dalai Lama. What was the purpose of this trip, and what were the topic of discussion during the meeting?
Well, about a year and a half ago, we went on a trip to Tibet. The Chinese government let us in, and Nancy Pelosi led that trip as well. We were like the first congressional delegation in many years to be able to go to Tibet. And I saw firsthand what the Chinese government was trying to do, and that is kind of erase a whole history, a whole culture. And I found that disturbing. And while they controlled our visit very tightly, we did have conversations with people who told us about the realities. And who told us that all they wanted was to be able to practice their religion freely, to be able to learn their language, and to celebrate their traditions. And so when we came back, we decided that we would do another trip, and which we just did, to Dharamsala to meet with His Holiness directly. But this time, to basically make it clear to the Chinese government that we support His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We support his right and the right of all Tibetans to go back to Tibet, to be able to practice their religion freely, to be able to live their lives as they see fit. His Holiness is not a separatist. He's not talking about forming a new country or separating from China. That is not what his message is. But he wants to go home, and so do his people, and the Chinese government ought to let him.
You just delivered a speech on the House floor calling for a new policy toward Tibet.
Right.
And you also introduced a bill called Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. Why is it important for the U.S. to have a new policy toward Tibet? And can you also tell us about the bill?
It's important that the U.S. has a new policy toward Tibet because the status quo isn't working. A year and a half ago, when the Chinese government let us into Tibet, I thought maybe that was a signal that maybe they were going to reassess their policy and maybe be more reasonable when it came to dealing with the Tibetan question. But things have gotten worse. I mean, the oppression has gotten worse. We were in Nepal before visiting Dharamsala, and the Chinese government has put pressure on the Nepalese government not to allow Tibetan refugees to be registered, allowing them to be able to legally work and have businesses and travel freely. And so, the Chinese government is just getting worse on a whole range of issues, jailing more and more Tibetans, in Tibet and in the Tibetan region. So, so I think we need to reassess, and we need to understand that just talking the talk is not enough. We got to start walking the walk. And the Chinese government regularly restricts U.S. diplomats and U.S. citizens and journalists from access to Tibet. Yet when they come to the United States, they can travel freely anywhere they want to go. No questions asked. What this basically says is we will treat you like you treat us. So if you're going to, reserve the right to restrict where we can go, well then we will reserve that same right. And beyond that, I think we need to publicly pressure the Chinese government more on the issue of Tibet. This is a human rights issue that needs to be resolved, and we should publicly call on the Chinese government to restart the direct dialogue that used to exist between the Chinese government and the Tibetan people. That needs to be restarted. The Chinese government should release all prisoners of conscience. That they have in their jails, and I think the United States, needs to appoint a special coordinator on Tibet as soon as possible to help elevate these issues. We've also talked about working with other countries and establishing what we call a group of friends on Tibet who would meet regularly and publicly to assess the situation in Tibet and whether there's been progress or not. But I think the Chinese government thinks this issue will just go away. The Dalai Lama is in his 80s, and they think, well, at some point, he won't be around and everybody will forget. The reason why we went to meet with His Holiness is to make it clear to the Chinese government that we not only support His Holiness, we support the cause. And we're not going away. And this issue is not going to go away. And we're going to keep on bringing it up over and over and over again until there's some change. Let me just say this. I want a good relationship with China. China is an incredible country. I've visited there. The people are wonderful, great history. China is one of the great powers of the world. They're doing great things on climate change. I support all that. I want a good relationship with China. But that doesn't mean that we ignore the human rights situation that affects so many Tibetans.
You are the co-chair of the Lantos Human Rights Commission. You touch upon that, about the human rights issue in China. Can you elaborate a little bit more about your assessment of the current human rights situation in China?
Well, the human rights situation regarding Tibetans is terrible. I mean, it is terrible, and it's gotten worse. But I'm also concerned about the human rights situation involving, the people in Hong Kong. I'm concerned about the treatment of the Uyghurs. I'm concerned about human rights defenders who are jailed because they speak up and offer criticism, of the way the system is being run. I think people ought to have the right to be able to dissent without being put in jail or being tortured or, or in some cases dying in jail. I mean, we've known, we on the Tibetan side, we raised the issue of the case of Tenzin Delek Rinpoche, who, died and they can't even get his ashes to bury him. And so I think the human rights situation is of great concern, and I think the United States and other countries have a moral obligation to raise it. And I also think our business community needs to be more engaged in this. I want a good business relationship with China. I mean, U.S. companies and Chinese companies, they make lots of money trading and dealing with one another. That's all fine. I have no problem with that. But I think the U.S. business community also has a moral obligation to raise its voice. And we met with business leaders when we were in India with the American Chamber of Commerce in New Delhi and in Mumbai. And I made the point that you all know what's happening in Tibet, but you don't say anything. And if you know what's happening, you don't say anything, then you're complicit. China wants to do business with you, you want to do business with China, but that doesn't mean you can't raise the issue of human rights.
What are the other global human rights violations that you're particularly concerned about right now?
I was concerned about the president's visit to Saudi Arabia, where he negotiated this big arms deal, but never used the word human rights. I mean, there are journalists in prison, sentenced with 1,000 lashes, for merely writing something that the government doesn't agree with. And I think some of these cases should be raised. The case I'm thinking of is the case of Raif Badawi, who is in a Saudi prison right now. I'm concerned about the human rights situation in Turkey. Obviously, the situation in Russia is horrible. I'm the author of the Magnitsky Act, and I think that the people who are guilty of human rights violations ought to be called out on it, and there ought to be a consequence. I'm concerned about the human rights situation, and in many of the African nations. That obviously, Sudan is a case that I care deeply about. I've been arrested 3 times in front of the Sudanese embassy protesting the atrocities in Sudan. So there are a lot of places around the world where people's human rights are being violated. I should also say too, I worry about human rights here in the United States. I worry about hate crimes and attacks against members of the Muslim community, the threats against the Jewish community centers. The LGBTQ community continues to be the victims of hate crimes here in the United States. So we're not perfect, but I think good people, whether in the United States or in China or in Russia or in any other country in the world, I think we have an obligation to raise our voices when anybody in our own country or anybody in another country have their human rights violated.
What is your assessment about President Trump's policy toward human rights issues and how he handles relations with China?
I haven't heard Trump mention the word human rights, either during the campaign or since he's become president. And I don't really know what his policy toward China is. One day he's critical, and then the next day, you know, he's best friends with President Xi. So I don't know what his policy is going to be. But I worry that he's focused on, you know, business deals and not on human rights. Secretary of State Tillerson said that human rights may not necessarily be in the forefront of our policy. I think that would be sad if that were to be the case. You know, I deal with human rights defenders all over the world. They count on us in the United States to talk about these issues. And if we're not going to talk about these issues, I think they will, you know, obviously they'll be terribly disappointed, but, you know, to not talk about, you know, like the issue of Tibet, for example, you know, for us to be silent, I mean, we lose our moral authority on the issue of human rights. You know, yeah, we want good business relations, we want good diplomatic relations, but the price shouldn't be that we turn a blind eye to people being oppressed. You know, His Holiness is a man of peace and love and truth and justice. I mean, that's his message. There's nothing confrontational about him. You know, he's not talking about creating a new country. I mean, that's it. You know, and I am always puzzled that a, you know, great power like China is paranoid over this monk. I mean, and paranoid over his message. I think if China were to show some flexibility on this issue, I'd be the first one up on the floor of the House of Representatives to acknowledge that, you know, to say that this is a positive thing, you know, that we are grateful to China for this. I mean, I think the world community would respond positively if China were to show flexibility on the issue of Tibet. And I hope that they will. I want to be able to say nice things about the Chinese government. Again, we were there a year and a half ago. We met with some, you know, wonderful people, and we met with some, you know, very thoughtful people in the Chinese government. So, you know, if they do the right thing on this, they'll win a lot of praise.
What is your message to our audience in China?
I have nothing but the highest respect for the Chinese people. And again, I had the privilege of traveling to, you know, China a year and a half ago, and I was, it's a beautiful country, and the people were so wonderful and warm, and I'll always be grateful for that opportunity and that privilege. But my other message is that human rights matter. They matter in China, they matter in the United States, they matter everywhere in the world. And there's nothing inconsistent about people being able to practice their religion, to be able to say what they believe, and live in China, or live in the United States, or live in any country in the world. I mean, everybody is entitled to human dignity. And I would say also to the Chinese people, you know, raise your voices on the issue of Tibet. You know, help create a climate where, you know, we can resolve this issue, where His Holiness and all of the Tibetans who are in exile can go home. This is not a threat. This would show a China that has that understands you know, the concerns of those of us who care about human rights, and I think it would enhance China's standing in the world. So, but we are grateful to the Chinese people, and I extend a hand of friendship.
Thank you so much, Congressman McGovern, for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.